Greetings! In this video, I will talk about the army of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which existed from 912 to 605 BCE. During this period, the Assyrians managed to conquer vast territories and turn their state into the first world empire in history. Take a look at the map. It's evident that during its peak, the Assyrian Empire covered all of Mesopotamia with its surrounding lands, and even managed to subdue its archenemy Egypt, with whom Assyria had previously contended. The key to success was the army of a new type created by the Assyrians. It consisted of two parts. Firstly, the army, known as the Royal Army, was recruited through conscription, overseen by provincial leaders. The other part of the army, a sort of guard or royal regiment, consisted of mercenaries, or, as we would say, contractors. This category of fighters received payment for their service. It's understood that warriors from both categories were fully supported by the state. Auxiliary troops from conquered peoples, such as Sumerian cavalry, Eurasian charioteers, and so on, formed an integral part of the army. The primary organizational unit of the army was the Kisir unit, numbering from 500 to 2,000 warriors. Kisir was divided into 50s, which were further subdivided into 10s. Several Kisir formed an Emuku force. The total strength of the army reached 120,000 individuals. Familiar military symbols emerged as well. Combat units had banners and standards depicting symbols mainly associated with the cult of the god Ashur, the supreme god and god of war. Soldiers and officers took oaths. The majority of the army consisted of infantry, which was divided into light, archers, slingers, and heavily armed spearmen. Slingers typically fought outside the formation of the army, on the flanks or ahead. They were capable of hurling stones the size of billiard balls up to a distance of 350 meters. Infantry, typically, was organized into 3 ranks. Sometimes the first line of the phalanx was made up of archers, protected by shield bearers. However, often the first 2 ranks of the phalanx were composed of spearmen, while the third was occupied by archers. Spear carriers in this case could bend down or kneel for the convenience of the archers shooting. Some of the archers used composite bows reinforced with horn and sinew from animals. Their range reached up to 600 meters. Nevertheless, the composite bow was quite expensive, and a significant portion of archers made do with simple bows. However, both types of bows fired arrows with iron tips. Burning arrows were also used during sieges. Heavily armed warriors were equipped with iron swords and daggers, javelins and spears, as well as clubs with iron bindings. The spear typically consisted of a wooden shaft with an iron tip and usually measured around 1.5 meters. Javelins were shorter and often had a bronze tip. Daggers were crafted more meticulously than before and highly valued. Several types of shields were used for defensive purposes. Large convex shields of conical shape were used in the formation of the phalanx. They were slightly taller than a person and typically curved inward at the top to protect against enemy arrows from above. Shield bearers planted them into the ground and held them by the handle. These shields were made of woven reeds covered with leather. Most heavily armed warriors used smaller round and rectangular shields. They consisted of a wooden base covered with bronze. The main type of armor was scale armor. It was made from metal, iron, or bronze, or leather plates. Heavy infantrymen typically wore such armor, while other warriors were protected only by a breastplate. Helmets also came in two types, conical and crested. Both types had a suspension system covering the back of the head and sides. Warriors engaged in siege work under the walls of besieged cities wore solid, elongated cuirasses made of fiber lined with elongated bronze plates. Legs were protected by tall leather boots laced up. A warrior carried a bronze pickaxe with a long wooden handle, which was used for road construction, fortification, breaking down conquered fortresses, as well as an iron axe. The main striking force consisted of chariots, drawn by 2 or 4 horses. Sometimes the horses were protected by felt or leather blankets. Attached to the chariot's body were a quiver of arrows, a shield, and a spear. The chariot crew consisted of 2 warriors, an archer and a driver, the latter equipped with a spear and shield. Initially, chariots were used for shooting at the enemy. Over time, with the advent of cavalry, chariots became significantly heavier. The crew increased to 4 people, and the chariot was used not only for shooting, but also for crushing the front lines of the enemy army. Among the Assyrians, for the first time as a distinct type of troops, real cavalry appeared, consisting of horsemen. Initially, the rider sat on an unsaddled horse, and then a high saddle without stirrups was invented. The riders fought in pairs. One was armed with a bow, the other with a spear and shield. Since it was difficult to shoot a bow from a moving horse without stirrups, warriors typically operated in pairs. One would shoot while the other controlled both horses. Then Tiglath-Pileser III reorganized the cavalry, and it began to act more effectively. All horsemen received standardized weapons, bows with arrows and long spears. At long distances, cavalrymen shot arrows from bows, but they could also attack en masse with spears, similar to how later lancers acted. It is indeed difficult for me to understand how a rider could deliver a powerful spear strike without stirrups, as it is obvious that the recoil of the spear upon impact at full gallop could throw the rider out of the saddle. It remains to be assumed that Assyrian horsemen, like the Getai of Alexander the Great, approached the enemy and began to thrust only after stopping. That is, the momentum of the horse was not included in the strike. The art of besieging fortified cities particularly advanced. Cities that in previous centuries withstood sieges lasting 15, 20 years were taken by the Assyrians in 20 days. During a siege, rams, catapults, siege towers, and assault ladders were used. The ram was a massive structure with 6 wheels. The wooden frame was about 5 meters long and 3 meters high. At the front of the ram was a tower about 3 meters high. The tower ended with a vaulted roof or a parapet and had arrow slits for archers. To protect against fire, rams were covered with wet skins. The ram itself was a log with a flattened metal tip, which was suspended from ropes to the roof of the frame and swung like a pendulum. The narrow tip attacked the joints between the stone blocks of the wall, loosening the masonry. Later, the Assyrians reduced the weight of the ram in favor of its mobility. It was placed on 4 wheels. Another type was a ram in the form of a cart with a sharpened nose. This cart was loaded with stones and, when propelled, directed towards the wall or gate. Catapults were used to destroy walls, hurling stones weighing up to 10 kilograms to a distance of up to 500 meters. In most cases, during a fortress siege, special siege towers were built, combining several functions. The tower allowed shooting at the defenders of the city with arrows. A retractable bridge could be lowered from it onto the wall, and it also provided a vantage point to observe what was happening beyond the city walls. In addition to rams and storming with ladders, the Assyrians often dug tunnels under the cover of special shields. When the excavation became large enough, the supports were set on fire and the wall collapsed. To overcome water barriers, special crossing means were made. Barrels. Individual warriors could cross on them, and rafts and pontoon bridges were also made from them. For the first time, the Assyrians began to use camels as draft animals in their supply trains. A camel could carry a load 5 times larger than a donkey and required significantly less water, thus greatly facilitating military logistics. It should be noted that the one-humped camel, dromedary, was used in the Assyrian army. Military camps were constructed at halts, which were surrounded by a circular rampart and ditch. Inside the camp were cross-shaped streets, with gates for troops to exit the camp. The Assyrians took care to create auxiliary units necessary for any campaign. Army blacksmiths repaired and made weapons anew, and for various types of earthworks, road construction, bridging, and other tasks, the Assyrian army had special units, laying the foundation for the development of engineering troops. The Assyrians did not forget about their naval forces. Ships for the Assyrians were built by the Phoenicians, who also formed the ship crews. These were primarily oar-driven galleys with sharp prows for delivering ramming blows to enemy vessels. The rowers were arranged in 2 tiers. Thus, in Assyria, the most advanced war instrument of that time was created, which is why the extensive conquests should not come as a surprise. However, such militarization of society carried internal threats. The Assyrian army, in numerous wars, even successful ones, still suffered enormous losses. The native Assyrians simply started to diminish. The Assyrians found, it seemed, a clever solution. When conquering another country, the Assyrians resettled its population to another part of their state, and in place of the displaced captives, they settled people from some distant province. Deprived of roots, the resettled inhabitants quickly assimilated and became Assyrians. Records of the resettlement of various peoples have been preserved, with mention of hundreds of thousands of people in most cases. We won't delve into all these resettlements, but will focus on one well-known example. In 722 B.C., the Assyrians conquered one of the Jewish states, Israel, and resettled its inhabitants to Media, while people from other areas of Assyria were settled in their place. As a result, the 10 tribes of Israel assimilated and disappeared from history forever. The inhabitants resettled in Israel became Samaritans, extremely hostile to the Jews. In the second half of the 7th century B.C., Assyria began to weaken and eventually fell, weakened by the blows of numerous enemies. In 626 B.C., on the ruins of Assyria, the Neo-Babylonian kingdom emerged, a sort of second edition of Assyria. Babylon managed to conquer almost all the lands of the former Assyria. It was as militarized a state as Assyria, and some Assyrian methods were repeated with remarkable precision. In particular, Babylon continued the policy of resettlement of peoples. Recall, for example, the resettlement of the inhabitants of Judah in 597 B.C. and the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. However, the Babylonian Empire did not last long, less than 100 years, and in 539 BC it fell under the onslaught of the Persians. There is no need to characterize the army of the Neo-Babylonian kingdom. Changes, compared to Assyrian times, if any, were absolutely minimal. With that, I conclude my narrative. Goodbye.